The Black Death was a pandemic of the bubonic plague which spread across Europe from 1346 to 1353. Historians estimate that the Black Death caused between 75 million and 200 million deaths in the 14th century, in the process wiping out between 30 and 60% of Europe's total population at the time. The traumatic results of the spread of the Black Death led to a number of social, religious, and political upheavals, the effects of which can be seen in a number of works of art and literature from that time and shortly thereafter. We could trace the origins of the Black Death to Central Asia, which was at the time controlled by the Mongolian Empire. The disease is thought to have been carried from Asia to Europe along the Silk Road with Mongol merchants or soldiers, and is reported to have reached the Crimean Peninsula by 1343. From there, it spread along merchant ships traveling on trade routes on the Mediterranean, reaching Sicily in October of 1347, which provided the entry point to the rest of Europe, with the plague expanding north and west, reaching England in 1348, and affecting nearly all of Europe by 1353. The plague is thought by modern historians to have spread so quickly thanks to a number of factors present in Europe at the time. Rodents and insects were the carriers of the disease throughout Europe, and were apt to stow away in merchant ships and in the cargo of traveling traders at the time. There were few, if any, hygienic standards at the time, and it was commonplace for the streets to be filthy, have livestock running around, which further allowed for the disease to spread. Once the initial outbreak occurred, the quelling of the disease was difficult for the few medicinal workers at the time to keep up with. The advancement of medical knowledge had stagnated during that period, as can be seen in the common practices used to treat the plague. Methods were used for treatment which were actually harmful to patients, including bloodletting and forced vomiting. With a lack of any tangible medicinal evidence at the time, the prevailing theory was that the plague was a result of people's sins, which was the explanation given by the Church. The Black Death proved to be the point at which disillusionment with the Church gained a head of steam, as many people grew skeptical of the explanation the Church gave for the plague spread, and were doubtful that it was actually caused by their behavior. The fact that there was an incredibly high mortality rate among clergy members contributed to this as well. Prior to the onset of the Black Death, clergy were seen as God's messengers on earth, and they had a heightened place in society as a result. The immense amount of clergy deaths understandably caused people to question these widely held beliefs, as though the clergy instead were no different from ordinary people. Many priests also abandoned the sick and the dying, fearful of the plague's effects, or they only associated with rich people who had the plague, hoping to be handsomely rewarded for their burial services. The Church also obviously proved to be ineffective in stopping the plague, and people lost faith in the institution as a whole. In England in particular, there were a number of consequences of the spread of the Black Death. The aforementioned problems with the Church sowed the seeds for the eventual rise of the Christian Reformation in England, based on the teachings of John Wycliffe. Another effect that the Black Death had was that it promoted the rise of the use of vernacular English, as the number of teachers of the predominant language at the time, French, would have dwindled. With this rise of the use of vernacular English came a rise in English literature at the tail end of the 14th century, which we see in writers such as Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer grew up during the spread of the Black Death, and was about 6 or 7 when the plague reached England. As such, we can attempt to view his works through the historical context of the plague and how it may have affected his life. Chaucer's most famed work, The Canterbury Tales, was written in the late 14th century during the recovery period from the aftermath of the Black Death, and is a collection of stories presented within the framework of a storytelling contest by pilgrims traveling to Canterbury Cathedral. It is interesting to note that there are hardly any direct mentions of the Black Death contained in the Canterbury Tales, and yet several examples of the possible effects of the Black Death can be seen throughout the tales. Perhaps most notable is the use of religion throughout the tales, and the role religion played in the aftermath of the plague. The general framework of the tales is based around a religious pilgrimage, and several of the characters portrayed in the work are religious figures. 2 characters of particular note are the pardoner and the summoner, who serve as 2 of the figures from the establishment of the Church, and in particular, the power the Church held in the secular realm. During that time, a pardoner was someone who sold indulgences from the Church to the people in order to be forgiven of their sins, in effect paying to be pardoned. In the Canterbury Tales, the pardoner openly admits that his job is one filled with corruption, even as he continues to sell indulgences, presumably for purely financial gain. We can view this anti-indulgence sentiment expressed by Chaucer as perhaps a result of his skepticism of the Church, which began with their actions during the Black Death. The other church officer was the summoner, who in Chaucer's time brought sinners to the Church's court to receive some penalty, possibly going as far as excommunication. Often the holders of these positions were corrupt as well, writing false citations and accepting bribes. The summoner depicted by Chaucer is one who Chaucer portrays as being hypocritical, since he is guilty of the same sins he is accusing others of having committed, and possibly receiving money from the corrupt pardoner as well. Chaucer, though rarely making mention of the plague itself in the Canterbury Tales, allows his authorial ethos to shine through with his opinions of the period, formed greatly by his experience of growing up with the Black Death being ever present. This is perhaps best seen in his attitudes toward the church, as many people were becoming less and less committed to the church, having seen their behavior during the spread of the plague as being unholy and generally unhelpful. Chaucer shows that he sides with this viewpoint by portraying the secular influence of the church as corrupt in nature, in particular via the actions of the pardoner and the summoner.